I've always been an early adopter and not afraid of taking risks. That's why I invested in a renewable energy business. My business has been growing steadily and my banking needs have evolved. But with Absa Business Evolve, I have the flexibility to tailor-make my business account requirements without compromising on service. Whichever Business Evolve account I choose, the Cash Flow Manager helps me stay on track with my business finances. I also get access to working capital, which enables me to focus on innovation as I have a banking partner that understands my ever-changing business needs.
Move to Absa and open a Business Evolve account online today and get free Cash Flow Manager and integrated accounting tool for your business. We do more so you can. That's Africanacity.
Right, greetings everybody and welcome to this breakaway panel number 5, which is entitled A Just Transition to Renewable Energy, Investment, Jobs and Communities. So we've got a fine panel of speakers lined up, all experts in their particular areas. My name is Rod Crompton. I'll be the moderator for this session. And let me begin by just making a few introductory remarks. This notion of a just energy transition arose about 35 years ago amongst the trade unions in the United States. And it's gradually and slowly built up momentum until today, where we find it's become a hot topic in South Africa. And there are some problems associated with it being a hot topic, but we'll address those later on in the general discussion. One of the things I like to do is to give some perspective. So the focus in the South African media tends to be that energy is equal to electricity, and that the just energy transition only concerns the electricity industry. So I would like to correct that by pointing out that in South Africa, the electricity industry is the baby brother in the energy sector. Energy is much bigger than just electricity. And the biggest brother in the energy family in South Africa by value of sales is the petroleum sector. Its value of petroleum products is much larger than in fact 60% larger than the value of electricity sales. So that will just give you some perspective. However, from an emissions point of view, and that's where the just transition comes in, the electricity sector dwarfs everybody else on the emissions front, notwithstanding their smaller role in the economy. They are a big player, and that has to do with our minerals energy complex history and our coal-fired electricity in particular, which is where a lot of the emissions come from. One of the complicating factors about the just energy transition in South Africa is that coal-fired power stations are designed to have long, useful lives, something like 40 to 60 years. And that means communities grow up around them and people form bonds. And some of these old power stations worked on a very paternalistic model where they supplied water and electricity and schooling and roads and all housing and all sorts of things to the communities around them. And that's what makes this energy transition particularly difficult. The other perspective that we need to bear in mind is that the just energy transition is not just about some coal miners and power stations in Mpumalanga. It's much bigger than that. One of the quick wins in the just energy transition would be energy efficiency, improvements in energy efficiency in motors, in factories, in residential properties. That could make a big difference and could bring about a lot of jobs and bring about a lot of efficiency without affecting a single job, for example, in a coal mine serving a coal-fired power station. And there are many other aspects to it as well. So just a word of warning, I know we've got a lot of electricity experts in this panel, but we have to think bigger than just electricity. Just energy transition covers all sorts of things. It includes oil refineries. And if you think about oil refineries, and the gas industry are the primary source of primary materials for the plastics industry. So if you're going to affect those in some way, you start to affect the plastics industry. And so the ramifications spread, like dropping the proverbial pebble in the pond. The ripples extend outwards further and further and further. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. Each speaker is going to give a brief intro to who they are and what they do, and then they're going to give us their views on this topic of the just energy transition. So first up is Dr. Edgar Foster. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crumpton and panel. Really good to be here. So I think I'm the odd one out here. I'm a geotechnical engineer, but I'm also currently the Chief Design Officer of Odaira. And what really makes me passionate about this in the world of manufacturing and mining, where I spend my day-to-day at the moment, is how we actually talk currently, a really acute talk about changing our status quo in terms of the use of fossil fuels and really get onto a different track, but to do this in a sustainable way. So what I love to do at the moment is think also a little bit about let's call it a radical collaboration that can be had between government and private sector and the building of new business if you just do things in time. So in terms of a just energy transition, and Dr. Crumpton, you've mentioned the coal fields, for instance, and also then other industries that rely on this. When I think with my manufacturing hat on at the moment, and how one might want to view how renewable energies could actually assist in transitioning around this just transition, then I think the first layer in that discussion for me must be the strengthening of the grid, but how to strengthen the grid. And I was really happy this morning when the minister said that the Round 5 or the successful bidders are coming online, because the one thing is to create a lot more empowerment of that grid, and thereby creating another dimension to our energy mix. But when you're a manufacturer, for instance, charity starts at home, as they say. And one of the things that I see in the world that I live in is that many of us, because we deem ourselves experts, want to solve problems in the way that we see them. So if you're in need, for instance, you're a large power user or a user that wants to go on a sustainable journey of new energy, then the first thing that you ask yourself is, well, how do I go renewable? But you don't often think properly about the strategy of what can you actually do to firstly become efficient, and then what choices do you need to make to actually add to that efficiency through an additional or a new power source, and how do you use your power and create enough dispatchable power for yourself so that you are able to actually run your business as you should. And then are there others in your vicinity or your precinct, if you are lucky to be in one of these economic zones or just a zone that have others that also require energy, and how you might leverage as a group to do things more efficiently. Of course, the further you get away from these, the more the discussion could become to how do you actually get power there. So that's one view. The second piece is when we look at closing things down, like power stations or even mines, and the real emotional view around the changing of jobs or future, or just the destruction of jobs. And then for me, the discussion is not really about whether renewables creates jobs, but it's about that activation of a society. And that's coming back to my first comment about creating time for oneself. If there's something that we've learned, for instance, in the West Rand, if you really suddenly need to close industry down, it's really very difficult to make a sustainable difference. And it takes a lot more work. But if you give yourself a little bit of time, and when you look at companies these days, it seems people are targeting a decarbonization view anything between 2030 and 2050, depending on their own responsible production journey. you can think of things and work with people to actually activate new economy. And that really excites me on this journey in the just transition. Thank you, Dr. Crompton.
Thanks very much, Dr. Foster. That's a very interesting start to our discussion. Next up, we're going to have Sarah Odaira, who's going to bring a mechanical engineering perspective to the discussion after our geotechnical perspective. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you for that, Rod. So my name is Sarah Odaira, and yes, I am a mechanical engineer, although I don't know if that is the perspective I'm going to bring to the conversation, but we'll see. So I work at the Strathmore Energy Research Center, where I serve as the acting director. And I think maybe just thinking about your question, just energy transitions, and linking it to what you said earlier, people often think of energy as electricity, you're right. And looking at it from a Kenyan perspective, one of the things that we often miss in the conversation is biomass. Biomass, I think, contributes about 68% of, or rather 68% of the energy mix is attributed to biomass. So we'd be amiss to ignore this in the conversation. And people will primarily use this for cooking in form of firewood and charcoal. And even the industries, for example, the tea industry in Kenya is a large consumer of biomass. They use it to get energy to dry their tea leaves. And tea is one of the largest forex exchange earners in the country. So you're right, we just can't look at electricity. We need to have a holistic approach, and looking at it from the perspective of justice. Justice means that you're putting people into the heart of the conversation, asking them what is it that you need, how is it that you need it delivered. And then, of course, we can't ignore the sustainability aspect of it, the emissions aspects of it as well. So that is the first thing that comes to my mind. And I think just looking at the conversations that we've been having globally about biomass use, the conversation has been revolving around transition from biomass to what we typically call modern forms of energy. And here we probably will have things like LPG or electricity. But the question is, how many people can afford this transition? We cannot ignore the economics in the conversation. So for me, justice here would mean looking at people where they are and seeing what they can do, and perhaps looking at sustainability in the aspect of biomass consumption. Even as we want to shift away from it, how can we ensure that we use it sustainability? So a top-down approach, meaning, trying to create policies that would enable that transition, but recognizing that that transition won't happen immediately, and supporting people where they are in terms of efficient technologies, in terms of looking at ways to kind of regrow this fuel so that we are not using it in a non-renewable way. And I think maybe the second thing I would like to say is that from a Kenyan perspective, again, we are very different from the South African context. 68% of our grid is renewable. So we can quickly see that for us, the question is not perhaps how to transition to renewable energy, because we're already there. The question is how we can maybe strengthen our grid, have more affordable supply of electricity, more reliable supply of electricity, because I think these are the things that would aid the manufacturing sector. And this has been quite a challenge. I think our manufacturing sector would say, for example, that 40% of their production costs go into energy supply. So looking at the energy trilemma, affordability, accessibility, and reliability. So I think I'm going to stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Some very interesting perspectives there. So let's move on to our next speaker, who is Gabriel Cruz, who is another engineer, but this time an electrical engineer. Over to you, Gabriel.
Yeah, thanks all, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining us on this panel discussion. So just a bit about myself. I am the head of engineering at Empower. And Empower is, the typical solar EPC company supplier. So, I'm definitely, bringing that aspect, but I do come from a background where I spent 4 years at the Kuburg nuclear power station, and I've spent, another 4 or so odd years implementing energy efficiency projects, and I've traveled through the sub-Saharan Africa, with meeting with various ministries and departments of energy, regarding, regional energy efficiency standards and so on. So that has really given me a very broad perspective. And I agree some of the comments that have already been made to say that, firstly, that electricity is a small player or a relatively small player in the overall energy transition. That said, the focus or the brief was a just transition to renewable energy, which sort of leads into the typical wind and solar or hydro. Unless you want to include the clean cooking, or biogas, or waste to energy into that discussion. But when the topic came up, the first thing that jumped to mind when the word transition came up was, the first transition we need to make in South Africa is transition from an unstable grid to a stable grid. So, we need more energy. We need to transition from what we have at the moment to more, and we can't really afford to take too many power stations offline at the moment. So, but taking a further look down the line, I can definitely understand why the coal industry, for example, the workers in that industry, are worried about the transition and are worried about, losing jobs. But that said, we can't not transition, from one to another, because of that. And I mean, if we take print photos, for example, we can't not move to digital photos because we're worried about, photo printing companies going out of business. I mean, imagine if we still had to take your roll, film to a company to get it developed. So, and as the transitions or as technologies evolve, some industries are going to grow and some industries are going to shrink. That's just the nature of, how technology works. And even if you think back at, some of the industrial revolution type of days, where, many people were left without jobs due to the automating, machinery that came into play. But people are resilient. People find, other things to do. And the second point to consider is that more energy, and a more stable grid, is better for the economy in general, which means, reduced load shedding or reduced power outages, which in turn, enables more growth, economic growth, or job creation. So there's definite an argument to be made to say that, a larger pool of energy that comes online at the moment will have an impact on, positive impact on the economy. Other points to consider is, mini grids and microgrids will definitely bring energy, to places where it's not at the moment, which in turn will enable, business growth in those areas that's currently not existing. So we're going to see, businesses pop up in areas that are enabled by electricity, that didn't have the opportunity before. A simple example: I've recently been in the central part of the DRC, and you can't find fresh milk there because they don't have the ability to cool. Most people don't have electricity, so they can't have refrigeration. So they're simply not milking the cow. So there's very little dairy industry there to speak of. So now, if you put, a proper quality power supply online there, there are different sort of spin-offs industries that will, be stimulated and created just because of the fact that energy suddenly becomes available. So what we're likely to see is that there will be a transition from people from the coal mining industries, not necessarily to the renewable energy industry per se, but into other industries that are stimulated or have become available due to the fact that more energy and more stable energy is available. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, and then we'll go on to some of the next speakers and let the conversation go where it needs to. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Interesting insights again. Our next panelist is Vijay Ravipal, who's also an electrical engineer, We're going to get his perspective. Over to you, Vijay.
Thanks and greetings, Dr. Rod and fellow panelists, as well as the guests that are attending today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear as a speaker on this breakaway session to discuss a just transition on renewable energy. Just to give you an introduction on myself, like Dr. Rod mentioned, my name is Vijay Ravipal. I'm an electrical engineer by profession and specializing in the energy and reduction strategy, carbon reduction strategies, that is, using best practices of low carbon and low cost, high return opportunities, as well as energy management. So my experience spans over 14 years of robust experience in the control and automation industry, spanning across many various sectors, that being the commercial, corporate and mining, as well as manufacturing. And I currently serve as the head of renewable energy within ABSA and responsible for the sector strategy, customer value proposition, as well as achieving growth targets aligned to the sector. So as many of my colleagues have mentioned today in the panel, in terms of a just transition, in terms of what the benefits are and why it's such an area that needs to be explored, apart from, looking at what it does to the GDP of our country and the economies in terms of job creation and so forth. I mean, I look at this transition as merely us moving over to a greener future and a transition to a greener future. Given the fact that, we look at what fossil fuel generation electricity is doing in terms of climate change that we are currently experiencing. I mean, it has a dire effect in terms of our future. And I mean, that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity. And in terms of this dialogue today, hopefully we can unpack what are the benefits in terms of a just transition to renewable energy, supporting our future as a country and globally as well.
Thank you very much for those initial contributions. Now we're going to start tackling some of the tough questions that relate to this. At the African Energy Leadership Centre, where I work at Wits Business School, we have been discussing this. And one of the big questions we've come across, and which I would appreciate your views on, is this. And all of you have supported this idea of a just energy transition. Well, at least none of you have spoken against it. So I assume all of you think it's a good idea. And you wouldn't be alone in that. Most of the people and most of the media think the just energy transition is a good idea. However, if we consider business as usual compared to the just energy transition, clearly they are two different things. Business as usual is, I've never heard anybody argue that the just energy transition is the business as usual with a different name. So they're not the same thing, they're two different things. And then it follows that if it's not business as usual, then there's an additional cost to switch to the just energy transition pathway as opposed to the business as usual pathway. So let's focus in a bit on this cost. All of you agree that just energy transition is a good thing, and everybody agrees with it. The question is, who's going to pay for it? So anybody like to volunteer? Gabriel, so shall I just pick on you randomly?
Go for it. Yeah, sorry, I see there are other people also interested to take this on, but I think we need to look at the cost of not transitioning. Because at the moment we are paying for this already. And the basis or the baseline that we're on at the moment is costing us both in rands and cents in our pockets, due to the electricity prices and the increase, but also, in terms of carbon emissions. So it's costing us a future, and we can't afford to not transition to renewables. But yeah, and to think that somebody needs to pay for it, is we're not going to have to pay for anything over and above what we are paying already. It's simply relocating or moving this money from one industry into another. So yeah.
Okay, interesting perspective, and rich source of further discussion in those points of view. I think, Edward, we'll pick on you next. Let's hear your views on this controversial question.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I always think, I had a mentor, and this was not his saying, but he always said that, doing good by doing good business. Firstly is there will be investment and also policy change that one needs to create an environment where business as usual can actually change. Because innovation very often, especially if it is a little bit either radical or disruptive, probably doesn't fit in the first place with policies. So we are in a stage in South Africa where we've actually made some of these changes to enable it. And once you do that, there become certain drivers that would push economy. If I look, for instance, how, for instance, mining is responding at the moment to this crisis, to the energy crisis, to keep their businesses alive, and where other large industries do something similar, the objective, if they do it right, and not just think of their own business, but actually get to the point where you then also, through what you're doing, is lift society in those zones. You get people in the end to start paying for it in the long run by being successful themselves. So although the question is no doubt about cost, I think when it's linked to good business, then the cost actually does get paid. I want to also agree with Gabriel in that case, from that perspective, businesses, especially ones that that see an environment which they can operate in South Africa or in other places where they operate, they would really go an extra mile to make it work. So the cost for me is something that works it out in good business, if they are allowed from a policy perspective to actually act, because they will act from the point of view of good business and thereby being able to lift also society in that way.
All right, thanks for that, Rod. I think maybe the one thing I would like to add to that is that we also need to begin to measure the cost of this business as usual. One of the damage that the business as usual is doing to us, one of the reasons we are saying that the transition is expensive, rather, is because we are not measuring the cost of the business as usual. And I believe there are ways that we can do that. For example, if we move into the way the electricity plans are developed and starting to measure or putting a cost to things like emissions, putting a cost to things like unreliable power supply, because those costs are there. I think the reason we are not observing them is because we are not measuring them. And once we begin to measure, then we're able to be objective in terms of our decision making. And I think the decision making would push us faster into justice, basically.
Well, coming from a university, I think that kind of science-based objective approach to discussions, which certainly in South Africa are very emotional and very intense and informed in many cases by very little science and very little objectivity. It's a very welcome contribution, Sarah, that you're making to the debate in South Africa, but I suspect in many other countries as well. Vijay, you got any thoughts on this who should pay question?
I guess the thing is, what are we currently paying for the current situation that we're in, especially with the dire constraints from an electricity grid perspective, I mean, the thing about who should be paying is you have to tie up what benefits is and what it's going to do and what it's going to change. I mean, given the fact that when you look at the business case in terms of transitioning to, basically a greener transition or one into renewables, you have to weigh up cost in terms of how does it become and how does it make you resilient in terms of having a fruitful production, especially when it comes to manufacturing, and looking at it in those respects. When it comes to renewable energy as such, one might look at it as from a first perspective and think that it's quite costly. But when you tie up numbers, these projects generally have a 4 to 5 year break-even point, And generally, these installations can generate anything between 20 to 25 years of electricity if we're just talking solar. That basically gives you close to 20 years of free electricity. And putting that into perspective, who should be paying for the cost? I mean, you need to take, we cannot be just reliant on the utility providers or government for that instance to help alleviate our problems. We need to take energy transition in our own hands to make us more resilient to what we're currently experiencing.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So I don't know, Roy, if you give me, if you don't mind me just adding to that. So, from a actual, project delivery side, we are seeing, investors putting up their hands all over. So, the money to finance these projects, is not a problem, both on the utility scale and in the commercial and industrial markets. So the guys are, wanting to throw money at, renewable projects, which is, very contrary to coal-fired power stations, if you're looking at new build for coal. And the big reason is because there's also money to be made for them. So as much as they are paying for this, it's really seen as an investment with, quite good returns. And if you look at the tariffs that were bid in, the last round for Eskom, coming in around 35 cents, 40 cents per kilowatt hour, it's much cheaper to go that route than to keep on going with the coal-fired sort of route. So, which goes back to my previous comment to say that we are paying for not transitioning. The more we stick to our business as usual, the more it's costing us and it's hurting our pockets. Where transitioning to renewables is going to end up significantly cheaper and over a 20 or 30 or 50 year period. So yeah.
So Sarah, let's come to you with this problem. Gabriel's right. There are lots of people queuing up in South Africa that I know of to invest in renewable power generation. However, you all referred here and there to the hidden costs. So the hidden cost in South Africa is that all of those investors so far have had 20-year power purchase agreements guaranteed by the government. So there's almost no risk. So people are making fantastic money out of taxpayer subsidized investments effectively. How did that happen in Kenya, to your knowledge? Did the state also guarantee the 20-year power purchase agreements for all of your renewable power stations, or how did the industry involve? And we're interested in this question because the capacity of the South African state to give those guarantees is pretty much exhausted. And the real test for investors' willingness to invest is going to come in the next few years when they have to invest without those government guarantees. And that's going to separate the wheat from the chaff, I suspect. Sarah, any thoughts on this topic?
So first, I'll say yes, the Kenyan situation in terms of the power purchase agreements is very similar to the South African one in terms of the 20, 25-year agreements. And here we have what we call take-or-pay agreements. So that has become quite controversial in the Kenyan context because we have situations where sometimes there's oversupply of electricity. So, but the IPP still has to be paid, right? So the IPP.
Did you hear that, South Africans? Did you hear that? You said oversupply of electricity.
So, and I think, the IPP still ends up having to get paid, and that cost ends up coming to the consumer. So we have our electricity cost right now is quite expensive, like I said earlier. And so I think in this conversation of just energy transition, we also need to think about it's the person that we are serving. It just can't be a conversation about renewable energy, because at the end of the day, if you have renewable energy, fine, you have clean energy. But if your electricity is still unaffordable, it's still unreliable, dare I say that it doesn't matter where it's coming from, people are still going to suffer. So we still need to think about the the metrics and perhaps go a step higher. Let's not just leave it at renewable energy. Let's think about the people that are serving that we want to serve, the consumers, and make sure that they're getting exactly what they need in a manner that they can afford. So as much as we have renewable energy, we still have our set of problems to deal with.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to go back to one of the points you raised in your earlier contribution. You said just is about justice and it involves people and so on. So if we think about this concept of the just energy transition, it can be analogous to beautiful. If you ask people, would you like to see beautiful things in your life? They all say yes. But if you ask them, what do you mean by beautiful? You'll get as many different answers as there are people you're talking to. We don't all see beautiful in the same way. And it's the same with just energy transition. And this is the question, is that everyone agrees with it, everyone supports it, but everybody has a different understanding of what they mean when they say just energy transition. So everybody's making up their own version. And the question I want to put to you, learned folks, is how are we going to deal with this problem where every person has got their own definition of the just energy transition and is presumably walking their path towards that definition, but we have no commonly agreed understanding of what we mean by the just energy transition. How do we, as a societies, how do we address that? Any thoughts? Vijay, maybe we start with you.
I guess a big one, Dr. Rod, is, the awareness that goes around it. I mean, my view of this transition, like I've mentioned, is basically a greener future for the generations that come, but it's all about how you bring out this awareness and how you communicate this out. As new technologies demand new skills, if not addressed on the onset, a lack of that understanding does create the different perceptions that you see, and suitable skills can create and, help in terms of getting the message across, especially when it comes to introducing technologies that drive the adoption of, this transition. And I mean, just retraining, and it starts from the early ages. I mean, if you look at it, why aren't we having the conversations at the primary school level where kids start having this as part of the curriculum and bringing out what it means from a just transition perspective? And I guess that's where the biggest impact is. What is a just transition into renewables? It's about creating jobs. It's about creating a greener future, like I've mentioned before. It's about sustainability. It's all of these impacts that, as opposed to the question before that you mentioned, is who's going to be paying the price for this? We're currently paying the price in terms of what COVID has done to the economy. And we're seeing this have an impact in terms of as many manufacturers are trying to recover from their losses as we reduce in terms of, restrictions. But then another hindrance being the fact that we had recently the unrest that has taken place, and then load shedding. That's our price that we are paying. It has a dire effect in terms of our economy, in terms of jobs out there, which increases poverty and unemployment. And I mean, that is where we should be using those points to try and enable communities to understand what is a just transition. And the just transition, from my point of view, is to have that resilience and to improve our economy and to get everyone working together in terms of having a sustainable future. But thanks, Dr. Rob.
Thanks, Vijay. Edward, I'm coming to you next. But I think one of the things, Vijay, we need to think about is if we had to teach just energy transition in our schools and universities, what would we teach? Because we all have a different understanding of what that means. Edward, you referred in your earlier remarks to the need to strengthen the transition grid. And I think behind that is the idea that a lot of our wind and solar resources lie in the western part of South Africa. And a lot of our demand for electricity is in the eastern part of the country. But at the moment, our grid is more like a one-way street flowing from the east to the west, and it needs to be strengthened to flow from west to east. However, one of the problems is that in our grid tariffs, we don't have cost-reflective tariffs yet. So we subsidize different people, and particularly those in the west of the country. If we introduced cost-reflective tariffs, we might see a relocation of renewable power stations towards the east rather than the west. But Edward, what's your view about how do we deal with this problem of everybody having their own definition?
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to hinge on what Vijay has also said. At the moment, there are two big trends, I think, affecting businesses in South Africa and also across the world. The one is that there is this global trend that we want to at least slow down a situation where we get a major climate change. And the other is social licensing. Now, in the South African context, we know that we have, over time, divested quite a lot in the way that we manufacture in the country and that portion of income. So if we put our focus to job creation, which really is a lot of the underlying issue around the social fabric that we have around businesses, then the just transition becomes a tool set towards that focus. And we could put our focus then on how we actually increase areas where we can create, in this case, a manufacturing environment that would create jobs. Because if we take that further, we know that, for instance, large manufacturing provides probably the most of all our industrial sectors in terms of jobs. For every one job in a large manufacturing environment, you could create 7 downstream jobs. And once we realize that, I think our focus becomes clearer. So the emotion around the immediate outlook of change, we could then temper towards a business outlook and make it easier from that perspective to hone ourselves to the same type of KPI. Because we're all working hard and we're all defining this in our minds. But that is where we want to go. And our just transition story is slightly different to what you might hear the same just transition story in Ireland, for instance, because you can read just transition about energy anywhere in the world. But in this case, we probably could hone ourselves in that regard. And already we are stating our claim towards climate change as well. And these become two very powerful, almost around the bride discussions. We all can relate to that. And that makes it extremely powerful if you and I, in our personal lives, can really buy that argument. And I think that's part of the way we should align this discussion.
So, Edward, I think you must warn your employer that certain universities might be seeking to poach you to come into the academic terrain if you carry on making smart contributions like that. No, I'm just kidding. Let's move on to Gabriel and get a sense of how you see the answer to this question of all these different definitions.
So, the transition talks about, going somewhere or changing, but I think we need to clearly define where we want to end up, because that will ultimately define, the route that we need to take to get there. So that's the first thing is, we need to paint the target or the end goal or the destination. And then the second thing that came to mind was, what's just for, and Edward made a comment, for what a just transition would be for South Africa is different from for Ireland. But even within South Africa, there'd be a difference in opinion, what is just for the coal mining industry versus what is just for, manufacturing or what is just for an energy off-taker, or what is just for a business owner and operator that has to deal with load shedding. So all of these people will have different opinions on what we need to do and what would be considered to be just or not. So which makes it even harder for us to pin this on one thing. But and this is where Vijay made a valuable comment earlier to say that it's really about people changing the way that they are doing things in the community and adapting to to the newer ways of working. And for the coal mining industry, for example, it could be as I've mentioned previously, working or moving away from that slightly into something, another line of, industrial work, which may not necessarily be mining. And the same thing for the coal-fired power station workers, So all of those skills are transferable. And just off the top of my head, the coal mining, sectors, workforces can be utilized in other mining sectors, which are still doing well. And the power station workers, the skills can be transferred, to other, types of industrial, plant manufacturing or processing, industries. So I actually honestly don't see, the job losses in the coal industry per se, being a critical factor in this just transition.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Might be different if you were a coal miner.
I'm sure.
What's underpinned by your remarks, and Sarah, we'll come to you in a moment to get your impressions, perhaps from Kenya, is this thing called change. It's something that the human species finds so difficult to do, is to change. People like to do what they've always been doing. They don't like to change. But that's perhaps another discussion for another day. How have you seen it from your perspective, Sarah? This problem of different definitions of the just energy transition?
I think you're right, and I really liked what you said at the beginning. People have different perspectives of what is beautiful, but I think maybe one of the ways to solve this challenge may not entirely solve it, but one of the ways to tackle it is perhaps to ask people, what would you like to see from the energy systems? Kind of similar to what Gabriel was saying earlier on, thinking about the end goal, because energy is not the end. We don't have infrastructure just for the sake of it. We want it to actually serve a purpose in our life. And if we begin to ask ourselves those questions, what are your expectations from this system? Do you want hot water? What is the most affordable way to get that hot water that is maybe least harmful to the environment? I think that's the first thing. Thinking of energy as a service, not just as an infrastructural kind of product, so to speak. I think the other thing that I would say as an answer, or as a beginning to an answer towards that question, is looking at the interlinkages between the energy sector and other sectors of the economy. So I think also mention of the coal sector, for example. So kind of trying to think, okay, if a just transition means that we move away from coal power and we are taking away these jobs, what other sectors can people move into? And then thinking what inputs, because it's, I think maybe speaking from a Kenyan perspective again, this notion that once you have sufficient electricity, you will, begin to see loads of development is not necessarily the case. Sometimes you need to have, or in most cases, not sometimes, you need to have inputs from other sectors as well. You might need to have to be training people. For example, if you're moving from a coal power plant to food processing and you've never practiced agriculture in your life, it's unrealistic for someone to expect you to start moving into this sector. So do you need capacity building? Do you need access to finance? Do you need access to markets to actually make this work? So thinking holistically, I think not a complete answer because it's quite a complex problem, but maybe the beginning of an answer.
Well, I must say, I really liked your remarks about a sort of demand side led approach, because that in fact is what's official South African energy policy in the white paper on energy policy. Of course, we don't follow it, our own policies. As a country, we have a supply push approach to most of our problems rather than a demand-led approach, but it is a very important question. In the remaining short time we have, I want to get your ideas on something that emerges from what a lot of you have said. Vijay talked about reforming the education system to include things and the education system and policy flows from government. Others of you have talked about policy and strategy, and all of those words imply some coordination, some kind of guidance from probably government, whether national government or local government or wherever. The snag we have in South Africa and many African countries is we have weak governments. We have a weak state, not always very competent in many areas. So how do we propel this just energy transition forward as societies if we have weak states, weak capabilities? And our ability to pursue industrial policies in South Africa is very limited. And, you talked, I think, one of you about, the deindustrialization of the East Rand and so on is, some of the evidence of some of these sorts of things. So how as societies can we advance this agenda in the context of having weak states?
Yes, Chair. I think so. What is so fascinating in South Africa at the moment is that we know we want to go to a different place, but we find ourselves with very limited funding. And although we've in the past had lots of discussion about private sector and public sector and others working together, now is almost the perfect time for people to engage that very strongly. And we see that happening in a variety of ways at the moment. From the talk of concessions of railway lines, which would previously not have been discussed, to the way that mining sector is transforming itself and reinvesting in areas not in mining, but actually in new development and new manufacturing to create economy beyond mining. To the way that we think about infrastructure per se across the continent. So a very good example of that for me is in a recent talk that I attended of Professor Seville of the Gibbs Institute, where he used the example of Costa Rica, at the time being, and it's actually quite recent in the 80s, being the poorest country in the region. And by a very clever collaboration with, in that case, Intel, to strengthen the environment by getting commitment from a private sector on the basis of strong health and education. And they linked a medium and a longer term plan whereby firstly they strengthen the infrastructure. In that case, business invests, but they also make a commitment that as they churn out students and pupils, that they are taken into jobs into these investing companies, and over a period of 30 years have created a considerable change in their economy. So to bring that back to the original statement, I think we are so ripe, and if ground is so fertile, for a very strong public and private collaboration, a radical collaboration that would make a very big difference if we open our minds to that. And I think business is hungry for it, and I think government is ready for it. And we see that seeping through at the moment, and very strongly driven also by the fact that we need to change from an energy perspective per se. So that would be an opinion.
Thank you, Edward. Very interesting perspective on collaboration. Very interesting challenges for a divided society like South Africa when it comes to collaboration, although we've shown even in the midst of unrest, we can have collaboration and cooperation. But let's go on to Vijay, and then we'll come to Gabriel and Sarah. This is our concluding question for this session.
I think I couldn't have said it any better. Yes, thanks. I think I couldn't have said it any better that Dr. Edward had mentioned. It's about collaboration and coming together for a common goal. And I mean, that's where it should start. I mean, given the fact that it has an impact on everyone, and bringing together stakeholders, either from a private public sector perspective and all that expertise that is out there, we can definitely make that change. Apart from that, you've noted that, earlier in this conversation where we spoke about access to finance. And I think by collaborating, we can challenge the status quo in terms of how traditional funding mechanisms help in terms of the, supporting the just transition. and changing those traditional ways and accommodating for how to make things more practical in terms of financing and having that available finance to support projects such as, support our just transition to renewable energy. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vijay. Gabriel, your thoughts?
So, yeah, I think in 2008, when government passed the bill and they established the single buyer office in Eskom, that was really one of the areas where the policy or legislation prevented the market from playing in an open space, and prevented the private sector from solving this problem on their own. Which they could have done. And now we're seeing changes in policy and legislation where and even directly from Eskom, where they are promoting the uptake of renewables, and in essence getting out of the way and allowing the private sector to serve the market, which at the end of the day results in a good sort of blended approach, which touches on the collaboration comment that was made earlier, where we have both Eskom and private energy service providers that provide energy to the markets. And I do foresee that at some point we will change into a market where you could choose who you are buying energy from on a month-to-month basis, or trading energy, even selling energy peer-to-peer from my house to my neighbor. And in that sense, enabling legislation will really be the key driver to promote that, and that will go a long way to allow a just energy transition.
Well, that's very interesting, Gabriel, and we'll come to you, Sarah, in a moment. That 1998 white paper on energy policy, in fact, makes the official policy of this country, South Africa, to allow electricity consumers to choose their supplier. It's an old policy. It's just we've got nowhere close to implementing it. But I think these themes that are emerging of collaboration and exploiting the initiative of the private sector are very interesting ways forward. Sarah, we come to you now and you have the advantage of wrapping up all of the ideas and injecting your own ideas as we come to the conclusion of this discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I think those were actually quite insightful. And I just want to add that even as we collaborate between government and the private sector, perhaps we need to think about the citizens. The transition from the weak states to the stronger states will hardly happen unless people actually agitate for it. And I'm thinking one of the ways that we could get people to agitate for our governments to become stronger is by educating them, by giving people the capacity to ask the right kind of questions. And what I mean by this, I'll give you an example. Kenya has been considering coal power for quite some time now. It's been quite controversial. And during this time, you would see some opinion pieces which are actually saying that, no country has industrialized without coal power. And I think the education perhaps that needs to happen there is that no one eats coal. At the end of the day, what you need is the electricity that comes to your house. And when it comes to your house or to your industry, you will not know where it came from. You'll only care about whether it was affordable, whether it was reliable, So if we educate people, give people the capacity to ask the right questions, and even this goes to the private sector as well, then we can keep our governments accountable and give them that strong push that they need towards stronger governance. So I think I'll end it there.
Well, that's a wonderful way to conclude our discussion, Sarah. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are all as enthused and inspired as I am as a result of the contributions of this panel. I think many countries have got national energy councils or panels and advisories. I think if we just kidnap this crew of this panel here that we have today and put them into those kind of panels, we'll solve a lot of the world's problems and a lot of our country's problems. So I'm sure you'll all join me in giving them a silent round of applause for some wonderful and inspiring and enthusing remarks. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you especially to our panelists for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.